James Walker was a police officer idolized in his small community in South Carolina. Every morning, he wore his blue uniform with pride, symbolizing strength, order, and the duty to protect the people. In that uniform, he was a symbol of justice and security, and the townspeople knew him as a man who was always there to help. But behind the badge, there was another side to James that most people never saw. His marriage to Laura, a white woman from a prominent family, gave James the image of a successful man. They lived in a large house inherited from Laura's family. From the outside, their marriage seemed perfect. Laura was a beautiful woman with noble lineage, always smiling at social events and keeping the house immaculate. However, behind that smile, their life was cold and distant. James felt trapped in a relationship that no longer had passion. During breakfast in their large home, the conversations between James and Laura were always hollow. Laura was more concerned with their social status than their emotional connection. For James, this added to the burden after long days at the police station. He often ended up at the local bar after work, seeking an escape from the monotony of his home life and the pressures of his job. The environment where James worked mirrored the larger problems within the community. Racism in the police department was unspoken but still present. Whenever a black suspect was involved in a case, there was harsh talk among the officers, and although James often remained silent, he couldn't avoid the prejudiced atmosphere. At the same time, he joined in the racist conversations of his colleagues, not because he fully agreed, but because he felt he needed to fit in to maintain respect. On the streets, black people often felt intimidated by police officers like James. When patrolling, James sensed the tension between the police and the black community in his town, but he never openly acknowledged it. For him, a job was a job, catching criminals and enforcing the law, regardless of their skin color. But deep down, James knew there was an inevitable bias. As the days went by, James' life felt increasingly empty. He continued his duties as a police officer with professionalism, but his soul was restless. Every time he returned home, he was greeted by the coldness and growing distance from Laura. Their relationship had long been dead, though both continued to pretend in front of the public. Their dinners were always silent, with only the sound of forks and knives cutting through the air. "James, we have a dinner invitation with the Harper family tomorrow night. Don't forget to get ready," Laura said in a formal tone, as if it were a duty as important as serving the country. James just nodded without saying a word, quickly finishing his dinner and rushed out of the house. He could no longer stand being in a home that felt like a prison to him. That night, like usual, James headed to the local bar, the only place that gave him a small sense of freedom from the routines and pressures that bound him. At the bar, James felt he could escape, if only for a while, from his dull life. Sitting in his favorite seat, he ordered a beer while observing the crowd around him. Every night, the same people gathered there: construction workers, truck drivers, and a few other locals who came to forget about their day. But tonight was different. Tonight, his gaze fell upon a woman sitting alone in the corner of the bar. The woman immediately caught James' attention. She was a black woman with thick curly hair and sharp eyes. Her posture was confident, her face showing a strength he rarely encountered in that bar. She sat quietly, sipping a glass of red wine. James couldn't stop staring at her. Inside him, there was an attraction he couldn't explain. She was unlike anyone else. She had an aura of power that was captivating. After a few moments of hesitation, James decided to approach her. He was driven by a curiosity he couldn't control. As he walked toward the woman's table, his mind was filled with questions. Who is she? What makes her so different? Before he knew it, James was standing in front of her. "May I sit here?" James asked, trying to hide his nervousness. The woman looked at him for a moment, then gave a slight smile. "Of course," she answered in a soft but confident voice. James sat down and introduced himself. "My name is James. Do you come here often?" he asked casually, though inside, he felt strange, a white police officer speaking to a black woman in a town full of prejudice. The woman looked at him sharply, as if reading his thoughts. "My name is Aisha. And yes, I come here often. It's a quiet place to forget a tough day," she said, lifting her glass of red wine. Their conversation flowed easily. James found himself drawn to Aisha in a way he hadn't expected. She wasn't just beautiful, but intelligent and full of confidence. Every word Aisha spoke made James more intrigued. Aisha shared her life, her work, and the challenges she faced as a black woman in a small town still full of prejudice. James listened attentively. At the same time, he felt an increasing internal conflict. On one hand, he knew that a relationship with Aisha could lead to big problems, especially in his racist workplace. But on the other hand, there was something about Aisha that made him feel alive again, something that had been missing in his dull marriage. That night ended with James unable to get Aisha out of his mind. He knew that beneath his uniform as a respected police officer, There was a growing desire, a desire that could lead him down a dangerous path. And so, that night became the beginning of a forbidden story that would shake James' life and test all the principles he had long upheld. The morning after James' first meeting with Aisha felt different. At the police station, he found his mind drifting back to the previous night. Aisha's face remained vivid in his thoughts, as if every smile, every glance, was still fresh. There was something about her that he couldn't ignore, though he knew better than to get involved in trouble. The typical small-town police station atmosphere returned, with his colleagues cracking crude jokes and commenting on the daily news they saw on TV. Usually James would join in, even if he often felt uncomfortable with the racist remarks coming from his coworkers. But this morning he felt distant, too preoccupied with thoughts of Aisha. "Yo," Walker called out Sanders, one of his colleagues, laughing. "What's got you all spaced out today? Normally you're right there with us, chiming in on these black kids' issues." James snapped out of it. "Nah, just got something else on my mind," he replied briefly, hoping to avoid further questions. Deep inside, he felt increasingly uneasy. The casual talk about the black community, which had often been a joking matter at the station, now felt more painful after that night. He now knew someone from that community personally, and somehow, it was starting to shift his perspective. The day dragged on, and as the sun began to set, James felt the same urge he had the night before. He wanted to see Aisha again. But there was something inside him holding back. He knew this relationship could potentially ruin his career and his reputation. He wasn't just a police officer, but also the husband of a wealthy and influential woman in town. Getting involved with a black woman, especially in a prejudiced place like South Carolina, could destroy everything. Yet his desire and curiosity overwhelmed all those concerns. After his shift ended, instead of going home, James headed back to the bar where he had first met Aisha. That night, the atmosphere was much the same as before, busy with people trying to drown their problems in alcohol. James entered and immediately scanned the crowd, looking for Aisha. There she was, sitting in the same spot, with that gentle smile on her face. James couldn't resist without a second thought. He approached Aisha's table and sat down across from her. "James," right, Aisha greeted him with a playful smile. "I didn't expect to see you back." James gave a tense smile. "I didn't expect to either, but I guess I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation." Aisha chuckled softly. "I tend to make people curious. But you, a police officer, should know better than to get involved with someone like me, right?" James felt nervous hearing Aisha's words, but also challenged. "Why? You're not doing anything wrong." Aisha sipped her wine and looked at James with a knowing gaze. "In the eyes of the law, maybe not. But in the eyes of this town, a white man like you and a black woman like me, well, we both know what people would say." James paused, considering Aisha's words. He knew exactly what people would say. They would see his relationship with Aisha as a betrayal of the social order. He could lose everything: his job, his marriage, even his reputation if this got out. Yet for the first time in his life, he felt something different, something real. "I don't care what people say," James declared with conviction. "I just want to get to know you better." Aisha raised an eyebrow, surprised by James' resolve. She knew that this relationship came with high risks, but there was something in James' eyes that intrigued her. Maybe, like her, James felt trapped in a cycle of life that never gave them true freedom. They spent the rest of the night talking longer, opening up to each other in ways James had never imagined. Aisha shared stories about her childhood in South Carolina, how she had struggled from the bottom and faced daily discrimination as a black woman. She spoke of her dreams, which were often thwarted by walls of racism and injustice. James listened intently, and the longer he listened, the more he felt there was a connection between them that went beyond skin color. Yet, during that conversation, James began to feel another kind of worry. Although he felt connected to Aisha, he knew that this affair could lead to major trouble, not just because of their different races, but also because of his position as a police officer. This relationship broke all societal norms, and more than that, if his colleagues in the police department found out he was involved with a black woman, he knew it could be fatal for his career. But his desire and attraction to Aisha grew stronger. As the night wore on, James felt an undeniable need to continue this relationship, even though he knew all the risks. They left the bar together, walking side by side toward James' car, parked on a quiet corner of the street. "I don't know why, but I feel like there's something between us," James said softly, as they stood near his car. Aisha looked at him, trying to read James' intentions behind his words. "I know what you feel, but you realize we're playing with fire, right?" James nodded slowly, fully aware of the risks they faced. But in that moment, desire overpowered logic. They kissed under the dim streetlight, ignoring the world around them. It was the beginning of a forbidden relationship that would soon pull them into an inevitable chaos. For the first time in his life, James felt free. But he also knew that this freedom came at a high price, and in the coming days he would have to face the consequences of his choices. Time passed, and the relationship between James and Aisha deepened. At first, their meetings felt like an escape for both of them, Aisha from the harsh reality of being a black woman in a prejudiced town, and James from a lifeless marriage and the monotony of life behind the badge. But slowly, their relationship evolved into something more complex, more dangerous. What began as an escape became an obsession for James. They started meeting more frequently in secret, always choosing remote places far from the prying eyes of society. James grew bolder, taking Aisha to motels out of town to avoid suspicion. Every time they were together, he felt alive again, as if his old, frustrated self had vanished, replaced by a man who was freer and wilder. On the other hand, Aisha also began to feel the depth of their connection. Despite knowing this was wrong and highly risky for both of them, there was something about James that kept drawing her back. Yet fear constantly loomed over each of their encounters. James knew that if their affair was exposed, it would lead to disaster. Not only would his marriage to Laura crumble, but his reputation as a police officer would be irreparably damaged. More than that, he knew his colleagues at the station would never accept his relationship with a black woman. In his workplace, interracial relationships were still a taboo subject, even though laws had changed and times had progressed. Deep-seated racial prejudices remained strong. Meanwhile, at home, Laura began to sense something was off with James. He was coming home late more frequently, offering flimsy excuses about work or sudden investigations. Although Laura wasn't usually the suspicious type, James' behavior had clearly changed. He had become emotionally distant, avoiding conversations and no longer showing affection the way he once did. Laura began to wonder if something was wrong in their marriage, but whenever she tried to talk about it, James would quickly shut down the conversation. One evening, just after James returned from a secret meeting with Aisha, Laura finally couldn't hold back any longer. "James, we need to talk," she said seriously as they sat at the dinner table. James, feeling guilty, immediately felt his heart race. "What's wrong, Laura?" he asked, trying to appear calm. "I feel like you've changed lately. You come home late all the time, and you never really explain what you're doing. Are you hiding something from me?" Laura asked, her eyes full of suspicion as she stared at him. James took a deep breath, searching for a plausible explanation. "I'm not hiding anything. There's just a lot of pressure at work. I've been dealing with some tough cases. It's not about you or us." But this time Laura wasn't easily convinced. "Then why are you acting like a different person? We barely talk anymore. You don't even touch me like you used to." James felt cornered. His guilt weighed heavily, but he knew telling the truth wasn't an option. His relationship with Aisha was too complicated to reveal. "Laura, I'm sorry. I know I've been distant. It's just a rough patch at work. I promise I'll try to do better." Though Laura still looked uncertain, she finally nodded slowly. "All right, I hope you can change. I just want us to be like we were." James felt a momentary sense of relief, though his guilt continued to haunt him. On one hand, he knew that his relationship with Aisha brought a happiness that had been missing from his life for so long. But on the other hand, he also knew that his marriage to Laura, however stale, was still the foundation of his life. He couldn't completely walk away from the life he had built, even if it no longer made him happy. Caught in this emotional turmoil, James continued his secret relationship with Aisha. They kept meeting in secret, planning getaways out of town to avoid detection. But over time, the pressure began to mount. James started to fear being caught, while Aisha began to question where their relationship was really headed. One night, after spending time together in a secluded motel, Aisha brought up the future. "James, we can't keep doing this. I know we care about each other, but our relationship can't last forever. You have a wife. You're a white cop in a town full of prejudice. We both know what'll happen if people find out." James stayed silent. He knew Aisha was right, but he wasn't ready to face that reality. "I know, Aisha, but I can't stop. I can't ignore how I feel." Aisha looked at him with sadness in her eyes. "But we have to be realistic, James. I'm not just some escape from your boring life. I have my own life to protect too. I can't keep being your secret." Aisha's words struck James in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time, he began to truly understand Aisha's position. She was a strong woman fighting for her dignity, and James realized he couldn't continue treating her like she was just an escape from his problems. But before James could respond, a message came through on his phone. It was from Sanders, his colleague. The message was brief, but it made James' heart race. "We need to talk. Something's not right." James immediately felt a surge of fear. The message sounded serious, and he knew it could mean something big. Had someone at the station begun to suspect his relationship with Aisha? Was someone starting to watch his every move? That night, James couldn't sleep. The thought of their affair being exposed haunted him. But more than that, he felt trapped between two worlds, the one he knew and the new one he had discovered with Aisha. A world where his desires were unleashed, but also one that could destroy everything. James knew that whatever happened next, his life would never be the same again. The next day, James arrived at the police station with a clouded mind. Sanders' message from the night before kept haunting him. Something was wrong, but James couldn't put his finger on exactly what. Did someone in the department already know about his affair with Aisha? Or was it just his paranoia growing out of control? As he walked to his desk, the office felt like any other day, officers joking around, phones ringing, and piles of reports cluttering desks. But when Sanders approached him, James could sense that something was off. Sanders, usually jovial and full of crude humor, had a tense expression that morning. "James, we need to talk," Sanders said in an unusually serious tone. "Somewhere private." James nodded, though his heart was pounding. They headed to a quiet archive room, where Sanders slowly closed the door before speaking. "There's something you need to know," Sanders said, staring at James intensely. "Yesterday we got a report from one of the locals. They've seen you out of town several times at motels. They said you weren't alone. That's not the issue, but what's worse. They said the woman you're with isn't your wife, James. And she's black." James felt the blood drain from his face. What he had feared was now coming to light. "What are you saying, Sanders?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though inside he was already panicking. "James, you know this is a big deal, right?" Sanders continued, giving him no room to dodge. "I don't want to get involved, but word's starting to spread. Some of the guys in the office are getting suspicious, and around here, people aren't going to just let this slide. You're a cop, James. What you're doing could ruin all of us." James swallowed hard, trying to grasp the enormity of the situation. His affair with Aisha was no longer just a personal matter. If the news got out to the influential people in town, or worse, his racist colleagues at the station, he knew his life would unravel. He had to act fast before everything came crashing down. I don't know what to say," James replied quietly. "I just need some time to think." Sanders looked at him with a mix of concern and firmness. "James, I'm your friend. I won't say anything, but you need to be careful. If this blows up, no one will protect you. Especially with her being. You know how people around here feel about interracial relationships. Especially if you're a cop." James nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what Sanders was telling him. Sanders gave him some space to think, then left the room, leaving James alone with his growing anxiety. He now understood this was no longer just an affair. His relationship with Aisha had become a ticking time bomb that threatened not only his career and reputation, but his entire life in this town. On the other hand, James felt guilty for Aisha. He knew this situation was becoming dangerous for her too. As a black woman in a town still steeped in prejudice, if the affair became public, she would likely bear the brunt of the town's wrath. They wouldn't just blame James. Aisha would be vilified, perhaps even seen as the one who had corrupted him. In the eyes of society, a black woman involved with a white police officer was a direct challenge to the social order. As the workday ended, James was trapped in a dilemma. His mind was torn. Should he end the relationship with Aisha to save his career and his life? Or should he continue despite knowing the risks could destroy them both? That evening, James didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove to Aisha's apartment, a modest building on the edge of town. When he arrived, nerves gnawed at him. He knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but he couldn't avoid it any longer. Aisha opened the door with a small smile, though her eyes were filled with concern. "James, what's going on? You look tense." James stepped inside and quickly closed the door. "We need to talk, Aisha. This is serious." Aisha looked at him, sensing the gravity of the situation. They sat on the small couch in the living room, and James explained what had happened at the station about the local report, Sanders' warning, and how rumors of their relationship were beginning to spread. "I knew this would be risky," Aisha said quietly but firmly. "But I didn't think it would happen so fast." "Aisha, I don't know what to do," James said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "This could destroy us both. If people find out, you know what'll happen, right? They won't just ruin my career, they'll blame you. This town won't let us get away with it." Aisha nodded, her eyes still filled with bravery. "James, I've known the risks from the start. I'm not afraid of what people say. But you need to ask yourself, are you ready to face the consequences? Because if not, we should end this now." Aisha's words hit James like a slap in the face. She was right. This relationship couldn't continue without a clear decision. If James wasn't willing to accept the risks, he had to end things before they got worse. But before James could respond, Aisha's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and her face immediately tensed up. "James, you need to leave now." "What?" "Why?" James asked, confused. "This isn't a question. You have to go," Aisha said urgently. "Now, before they get here." James felt the sudden rush of tension. Without thinking much, he rushed out of Aisha's apartment, hurrying towards his car. But as he neared his vehicle, he saw in the distance several police cars approaching, their sirens flashing. His heart pounded in his chest. Was this the end of everything? The flashing siren and the sound of a police car's engine approaching made James panic. He knew that if he got caught at Aisha's place, everything would fall apart. Their secret relationship would be exposed, and worse, Aisha could end up in serious trouble. Without a second thought, James jumped into his car, started the engine, and sped away from Aisha's apartment, trying to escape before the police arrived. Meanwhile, Aisha stood at her apartment door, staring at the street with a tense expression. She knew the situation had become far too dangerous. It wasn't just James who was in danger, but she was as well. In a small town like this, a black woman involved with a white police officer could easily become a target of hate and prejudice. She didn't know who had reported them or what was really going on, but her instincts told her that something terrible was on the horizon. Inside his car, James drove fast, glancing occasionally in the rearview mirror to make sure no one was following him. The suburban streets were empty, lit only by dim streetlights. The sound of the siren behind him began to fade, giving James a glimmer of hope that he might have escaped. But his mind kept racing, trying to figure out who reported their relationship and why the police had sent a patrol car to Aisha's apartment. As he reached the highway, his phone vibrated. It was a message from Sanders. "Where are you? A team from another division is looking for you. This is serious, James. They got a report on you." The message made James feel even more anxious. Sanders was the only friend who knew what was really going on, but even he couldn't stop this situation. James knew he couldn't keep running aimlessly. He had to figure out how to fix this, but at that moment he felt trapped between the threats from his job and the reality that his relationship with Aisha was now in the spotlight. After putting enough distance between him and Aisha's apartment, James pulled over to the side of the road to try to calm down. His hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts still swirling. He had to make a quick decision. What would he do next? If he went back to the police station, he would likely be interrogated. But if he fled, it would only make things worse. Suddenly, a thought crossed his mind: Laura, his wife. He realized that if news of his affair leaked to the department, Laura would soon find out. Although their relationship had been cold for a long time, James still felt a heavy burden from the idea that he had betrayed her. He wasn't ready to face Laura's anger and disappointment, especially in the midst of all this chaos. But before James could come up with a clear plan, the sound of sirens reached his ears again, this time closer. He looked in the rearview mirror and saw two police cars approaching rapidly from the opposite direction. His heart started racing again, and without thinking, he pressed down on the gas pedal, speeding off as fast as he could. That night turned into a thrilling chase. James, who was usually the one doing the chasing, had now become the prey. The empty highway became a dangerous racetrack, with the sound of screeching tires every time James made a sharp turn to avoid the police cars that kept pursuing him. The blue lights from the sirens illuminated the road ahead, adding to the mounting pressure. James knew he couldn't keep running forever. He had to find a place to hide or come up with a plan, but the town offered few options. Every turn he took felt like a dead end, and every street he passed seemed to narrow his chances of escape. After what felt like hours but was only a few minutes, James finally spotted a small road leading into the hills outside of town. Without hesitation, he turned onto the road, hoping the police wouldn't follow him into the remote and difficult-to-access area. The road was rocky and dark, lit only by his headlights. James turned off the headlights and slowed down, hoping that the fading sirens meant he had successfully evaded them. Once he felt safe, James pulled over beside a large tree, turned off the engine, and took a deep breath. In the stillness of the night, he could hear the pounding of his own heart. For the first time in the past few hours, he felt a small sense of relief, though he knew it was only temporary. He couldn't stay hidden forever. But James's thoughts didn't stop there. With an empty feeling in his chest, he thought about his future, his marriage, his career, and his relationship with Aisha. Everything he had built seemed to be crumbling before him. He was trapped in a world that he could no longer control. As James sat in the car, staring out into the dark night, A sudden knock on the side window startled him, nearly making him jump out of his seat. He turned and saw the figure of someone standing outside his car, their face unclear in the darkness. Whoever it was, they had found James in this secluded spot. His heart began to race again, preparing for whatever might come next. James stared at the dark figure outside his car window, his blood racing. The knock came again, softer this time but still insistent. With trembling hands, he slowly rolled the window down, trying to see who was out there while still keeping a safe distance. "James, it's me." The voice instantly brought a mix of relief and surprise. It was Sanders. In the darkness of the night, his face was barely visible, but his voice was unmistakable. James quickly opened the car door and stepped out, still filled with confusion. "What are you doing here, Sanders? How did you even know I was here?" James asked, trying to keep his voice low. He didn't want anyone to hear them. Sanders let out a long sigh before answering. "I followed you, James. I knew you wouldn't go home, so I decided to track you down. I was worried you might do something stupid." James looked at Sanders with gratitude, though his heart was still full of tension. "I don't know what to do, Sanders. This whole thing, it's a mess. The relationship, the job, the cops chasing me, it all feels like a trap." Sanders gently patted James on the shoulder. "Listen, I'm not going to let you fall apart, but you need to start thinking clearly. If you keep going like this, there's no way out. They know about Aisha, James, and they're going to use it to bring you down." James shook his head, feeling more frustrated. "I know, but I can't just abandon Aisha. I can't give her up. This isn't just an affair, Sanders. I care about her." Sanders looked at James deeply, as if weighing a difficult decision. "I get it, but what you're facing isn't just personal anymore. This has become political and social, James. They won't stop until you're ruined. And Aisha, they won't hesitate to drag her into this mess." James listened intently, but he still felt trapped between two worlds. On one hand, he felt responsible for Aisha, the woman he loved, in the midst of all this chaos. On the other, he knew that continuing this would only make things worse. "What should I do, Sanders?" he asked, his voice filled with despair. Sanders was silent for a moment, carefully choosing his words. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I think you need to talk to Aisha. Tell her the truth. She needs to know that if this relationship continues, it will destroy both of you. You have to be honest, James." James's chest tightened. He knew Sanders was right, but facing Aisha directly seemed like an impossible step. Before he could respond, Sanders continued. "And there's something else. This is bigger than just the affair. I've heard rumors that there are people in the department with a political agenda. They're using this to take you down. And Aisha? She could become a target." James was shocked. "What do you mean?" "A political agenda." Sanders looked at James with a serious expression. "I don't know all the details, but I've heard whispers about factions within the police force who don't like the growing liberal attitudes in this town. They're using your case to send a message. You're their scapegoat, James." James was confused. "So, this isn't just about me and Aisha? They're using this for something bigger." Sanders nodded slowly. "Exactly. And if you stay involved with Aisha, they'll use it to make you look even worse. Not just as a cop breaking the rules, but as a white man involved with a black woman. You know how these people operate." Sanders' words made everything more complicated for James. This wasn't just about his personal choices anymore. There were larger forces at play, and he had become a pawn in their game. "So what's the plan?" James asked, his voice low. Sanders let out another heavy sigh. "You need to back off for a while. Keep your distance from Aisha. Let this situation cool down. If you don't, they'll use every move you make as ammunition to destroy you." James felt a weight in his heart. He knew that taking this step meant sacrificing something precious. But in the middle of this chaos, he also knew that it might be the only way for both him and Aisha to stay safe. "I'll talk to Aisha," James finally replied, his voice sounding defeated. Sanders gave him another reassuring pat on the shoulder before turning back to his car. "Take care of yourself, James. And remember, you're not alone in this." James nodded, though deep down he felt incredibly alone. As Sanders drove away, James stood there in the dark, thinking hard about his next move. He now had to face the bitter reality that this wasn't just about a forbidden love, it was about survival in a town that had no mercy. James got back into his car and stared at the long, empty road ahead of him. In his mind, there was only one thing left: the final conversation he had to have with Aisha. That morning, James sat in his car outside Aisha's apartment. The sun had just risen, but the atmosphere felt heavy. His mind was still consumed with the conversation he had with Sanders the night before. As he gazed at Aisha's front door, guilt and fear intertwined within him. He knew what he had to do, but actually doing it felt harder than he ever imagined. James got out of the car, took a deep breath, and walked toward Aisha's apartment door. He knocked softly, feeling each second tick away like a ticking time bomb. Moments later, the door opened, and there stood Aisha. Her face looked tired, yet her eyes remained attentive. She offered a faint smile upon seeing James, though the weariness was evident behind it. "James," she said quietly, letting him in. James entered the apartment without saying much. The ambience inside felt warm and familiar, yet in his heart, the feeling was becoming increasingly foreign. They sat on the small sofa where they usually did, and for a moment no words were exchanged. Only a suffocating silence filled the air. Aisha broke the ice. "What happened last night? You left so quickly. What's really going on?" James sighed deeply, carefully choosing his words. "Aisha, there's something I need to talk to you about. It's important, and I hope you can understand." Aisha looked at him seriously, knowing this wasn't just a casual conversation. "Is this about the police coming last night?" James nodded slowly. "They know about us. They know about our relationship. And now it's turned into a big problem. It's no longer just about the two of us, Aisha. There are people in the department who want to use this relationship to take me down. And you too." Aisha's face tensed, but she didn't appear shocked. "I knew the risks from the beginning, James. I knew what could happen if we got caught. But I also know this isn't our fault. It's not our fault for loving each other." James felt a tightness in his chest at her words. "I know, Aisha. But the reality is, they don't care. They will use this to destroy us, especially you. I don't want you to become a victim." Aisha paused for a moment, then spoke in a quieter tone. "So what are you saying? Do you want us to stop?" James looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "This is for your safety, Aisha. If we continue like this, they won't stop until they've ruined our lives. I can't let that happen to you." The atmosphere between them grew heavier. Aisha gazed at James with a wounded look, but also with understanding. She knew that what he was saying wasn't out of desire, but from a need to protect them both. Yet the reality remained painful. "I know you just want to protect me," Aisha finally said, her voice slightly trembling. "But I hate that we have to give up just because they're racist. Because they can't accept that we're different. This isn't our fault, James." James nodded in agreement, feeling heartbroken by the reality. "I hate this too, Aisha. Believe me, there's nothing I want more than to be with you. But I have to be realistic. They're stronger than we are." Tears began to well up in Aisha's eyes, but she held them back. She took a deep breath and said, "If this is your decision, I'll accept it. But I want you to know that I've never regretted what we have." James felt a lump in his throat. "I've never regretted it either. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." They fell silent, gazing at each other in an emotionally charged stillness. James knew that this separation would devastate them both, but he also knew it was the only way to protect Aisha from this unjust world. They were both trapped in a situation they never wanted, but had to face. Finally, James stood up, his heart feeling heavy as a stone. "I have to go, Aisha. I can't stay here long. I don't want anyone to see us." Aisha stood too, looking at him with tear-filled eyes. "Okay, James, but remember, you're not alone in this. No matter what happens, I will always care about you." James couldn't hold back any longer. He pulled Aisha into a tight embrace, feeling the warmth of her body for the last time. Aisha returned his hug, gripping him tightly, as if they both knew this might be their last moment together. After what felt like an eternity, James finally released her from the embrace, his heart heavy with unspoken words. Without saying anything else, he walked out of Aisha's apartment, leaving behind the woman he loved and all their shared memories. As the apartment door closed behind him, James felt the world he knew slowly crumbling. He understood that this decision was the best for both of them, but the emptiness inside him was undeniable. Deep within, he felt he had lost something irreplaceable. James got into his car and drove home, his mind filled with thoughts of a future that was now uncertain. Yet one thing he knew for sure: whatever happened next, he had to face the consequences head on. And even though he had parted ways with Aisha, he knew their love would always live on, hidden beneath all the injustice surrounding them. But deep in his heart, James felt an unshakable fear. This wasn't over. The threat from his fellow officers still loomed, and he knew there would be more obstacles ahead. The fight had just begun. James returned to his home in the suburbs, where the atmosphere was eerily quiet. Laura, his wife, was working as usual. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now stood as an empty space devoid of warmth. Their relationship, already strained, had now completely fractured. Yet, despite the imperfections in their marriage, James felt haunted by guilt not only for the affair but also because he realized that everything could soon be revealed. As he stepped inside, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number came through. James read it, his heart suddenly racing. "You think you can just walk away? We know everything." James's throat went dry as he read those words. This wasn't an ordinary threat. The message felt like a warning, or perhaps an ultimatum. They knew more than just about his secret relationship with Aisha. This was bigger than he had anticipated. What did they mean by everything? Increasingly worried, James's mind raced with grim possibilities. He quickly called Sanders, hoping for answers. After a few rings, Sanders picked up. "What's going on?" James Sanders asked, his tone cautious. James explained the message he had just received. "What do they mean by 'we know everything'? Are they talking about my relationship with Aisha, or is there something more?" There was a pause before Sanders replied. "I'm not sure, but I've heard rumors around the department. There's a team from internal affairs digging deeper into old cases you've handled. They're looking for dirt, James. If they can connect this to your career, they'll use everything they've got." James felt his heart racing. He knew that in his career as a police officer, many tough decisions had to be made, some of which could easily be twisted by those looking to destroy him. However, he never imagined his personal issues would be used to dig into his past and weaponize it against him. "You need to be careful," Sanders continued. "This isn't just about your relationship with Aisha anymore. They're looking for a way to obliterate your career, maybe even more." James felt cornered. They weren't just aiming to destroy his relationship, they wanted to obliterate his entire life. He had no idea who was behind this, but it was clear this was more than just an affair. There were larger forces at play. "Is there anything we can do?" James asked, his voice low but hopeful. "I still have a few contacts in internal affairs," Sanders replied. "I'll try to find out what they're planning. In the meantime, you have to tread carefully. Don't make any rash moves. If you give them a reason, they'll hit you hard." James ended the call with his mind spiraling further into chaos. That threatening message, combined with Sanders' information, made him realize that this situation had spiraled out of control. He was not only being hunted by authorities, but was also becoming a target of something much larger, something extremely dangerous. That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept replaying his past, trying to remember if there had been any mistakes he had made, anything they could use against him. Every decision he had made over his years as a police officer now haunted him. In the quiet of the night, his phone buzzed again. Another message came in. "You won't be able to hide. Your time is running out." James was taken aback as he read that message. This was no longer a vague threat, it was a direct warning that they would move quickly, and his time was running short. He immediately tried to call Sanders again, but this time there was no answer. James reached out to several other colleagues, but none picked up. Anxiety gripped him tighter. He felt as though the entire world was conspiring to take him down, and he had no idea where to turn. At that moment, he heard the doorbell ring. He suddenly tensed, his heart racing. Who would come at this hour? He walked quietly to the front door, glancing out the window to see who it was. Outside stood two men in black suits. There were no police cars in front of his house, just an unmarked black sedan. James's instincts as a police officer screamed that this wasn't a routine visit. These were not people from internal affairs. They were someone else, people who shouldn't be here. A chill ran down James's spine. He knew opening the door wasn't a safe option, but he also couldn't stay silent. Taking a deep breath to steady himself, he walked to the kitchen and grabbed his service pistol from the drawer. When he returned to the living room, the doorbell rang again, this time more insistently. The men outside seemed increasingly impatient. James knew this was a critical moment. He had to decide now, flee or confront them. James stood in the middle of the living room, gripping his gun with trembling hands. Each passing second felt like an explosion in his mind. Who were these people? Were they part of the police, or something far darker? The thought loomed over him as he stared at the front door, which now felt like a thin barrier between him and the approaching danger. The doorbell rang again, louder and more insistent. The two men outside were growing impatient. James's breaths were short and rapid. His instincts as a police officer urged him to take action, but another part of him knew that confronting them now could be a fatal mistake. He had to think fast. Without hesitation, James slowly backed away from the door and hurried toward the back of the house. He knew the front door wasn't an option. Facing the men outside could get him killed or caught in an even worse situation. He opened the back door cautiously, making sure there was no sound, then stepped out into the backyard. The night air was cold against his skin. He scanned his surroundings cautiously, ensuring no one was following him. After feeling safe, he sprinted across the backyard toward the fence. James leaped over the fence nimbly, landing on the other side without making a sound. He knew that in situations like this, silence was his most powerful weapon. Behind him, he heard the front door of his house slam open. They were already inside. James closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his ragged breathing. They were searching for him in the house. He didn't have much time. James rushed toward the narrow path behind the row of neighboring houses. He decided not to return to his car too risky, as they might already know where it was parked. Instead, he chose to keep moving down the dark, narrow alley, away from the view of the main street. For several minutes, James ran without stopping, adrenaline fueling his pace. He knew he needed to find a safe place quickly, but where? The police clearly couldn't be trusted now. There could be more people inside ready to trap him. Sanders was unreachable, and others he usually trusted seemed to have vanished. James finally stopped at a small, dark park, gasping for breath and trying to control his fear. He dug into his pocket, pulled out his phone again, and attempted to call Sanders for the third time. This time Sanders' voice came through, but it sounded strange, heavy, and hurried. James Sanders sounded worried. "Where are you right now?" "Two guys came to my house," James said, his voice shaking. "They're not police. I don't know who they are, but they're chasing me. I got out of the house and now I'm outside running from them." There was a pause on the line before Sanders spoke seriously. "James, you're not safe. This is bigger than I thought. They're not just after you because of your relationship with Aisha. There's a huge conspiracy behind this, and the people who came to your house might not be from internal affairs. They could be hitmen working for someone higher up." James's heart raced faster at Sanders' words. "Hitmen? Sanders, what the hell is going on?" "I don't have much time to explain," Sanders replied urgently. "I know a safe place for you. There's an old warehouse outside the city near Oak Ridge Pier. I'll meet you there in an hour. Don't stay in one spot for more than 5 minutes, and don't let them see you." James agreed, though his mind was filled with questions. What was really happening? Why were there hitmen after him? All of this was far bigger and more dangerous than he had imagined. Without wasting any time, James took off running again. He knew that now there was no room for mistakes. Every wrong step could mean the end of his life. Oak Ridge Pier wasn't far from there, but he had to navigate through densely populated areas where he could easily be spotted by anyone pursuing him. Every small sound around him made James more alert. He moved through narrow alleys and quiet streets, avoiding crowded areas. He always made sure not to linger in one spot too long. Every second spent outside increased the risk of being discovered. After nearly an hour, James arrived at the edge of Oak Ridge Pier. The warehouse Sanders mentioned looked old and abandoned, a perfect hiding spot. Carefully, James slipped inside through the slightly ajar back door. Inside, the atmosphere was damp and gloomy, with the smell of rust and rotting wood filling the air. The dim light from the street lamp outside barely illuminated the room. James waited, trying to calm his racing heart. His mind was still spinning, contemplating who could have sent hitmen after him and what it had to do with the case. His only hope now rested with Sanders. He prayed his friend would truly be able to help him out of this mess. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching. James felt his entire body tense up. He raised his gun, ready to face whatever was coming. In the darkness, he saw a silhouette moving closer. "Sanders," James called out hesitantly. But before he could finish his sentence, the figure raised a weapon. It wasn't Sanders. The sound of a gunshot echoed loudly through the warehouse, and James felt the bullet whiz by just inches from his body. The sound of gunfire echoed in the old warehouse, shattering the stillness of the night. James quickly took cover behind a stack of rickety wooden crates, his breath quickening. A bullet had nearly hit him, and now he knew he was up against an enemy far more ruthless than he had imagined. The figure who had just shot at him was not Sanders, it was someone sent to finish him off. James tried to remain calm and focused, even as adrenaline coursed through his body. He peeked out from behind the crates, watching the shadow of the armed man move slowly, like a predator stalking its prey. The warehouse was dark and cluttered, but every corner felt too exposed now. He didn't have many places to hide, and every second felt increasingly dangerous. In mere seconds, James made a decision. He had to move before the man found him. Quickly, he crawled through the piles of old junk and discarded tools, hoping his enemy wouldn't see his movements. The sound of footsteps drew closer, heightening the tension in the air. Suddenly, the armed man stopped right beside the stack where James was hiding. James's heart raced faster, and for a moment he held his breath, praying the man wouldn't notice him. But the man seemed to sense something. He turned around quickly and fired without warning. James reacted instinctively, rolling to the side and firing back with his own gun. His shot missed, but it was enough to divert the man's attention, giving him a moment to run in another direction. However, the man didn't relent. He immediately pursued, and gunfire erupted between them, filling the room with deafening noise. James continued to run among the stacks of debris, searching for an opening to counterattack. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted the back door of the warehouse, a potential escape route that could be his only hope. But the armed man was closing in, firing bullet after bullet with deadly precision. In that critical moment, James suddenly noticed a large barrel nearby, an old container filled with oil or some other unused chemical. A crazy idea formed in his mind. He aimed his gun at the barrel, hoping the liquid inside would spill out and create chaos. The bullet struck the barrel, and just as he had hoped, the liquid exploded out, spilling across the warehouse floor. In an instant, the armed man slipped, losing his balance. James wasted no time, sprinting for the back door, praying it would lead him out of this deadly situation. As James reached the back door and flung it open, he heard one last gunshot, but this time it didn't come from his enemy. He turned around to see the man lying on the floor, blood pooling from a wound in his body. Across the room, someone stood in the doorway of the warehouse. James squinted and finally recognized who it was: Sanders. James Sanders shouted, rushing toward him. "Are you okay?" James was still panting, his body shaking from adrenaline. "Yeah, but who was he? Why was he chasing me?" Sanders looked at the man lying on the ground, then sighed quietly. "They sent this guy to take you out, James. There's a big conspiracy within the police department, and you're just a small part of that puzzle. I've heard they want to cover up a scandal much bigger than this, and the people who know too much, like you, become their targets." James struggled to digest everything. "But why? What does Aisha have to do with this?" Sanders shook his head. "Your relationship with Aisha is just an excuse for them to act, James. It's not the core of the issue. They're using that relationship to bring you down, but there's much more happening behind the scenes. There's massive corruption, illegal arms trafficking, and many more dirty secrets that will be exposed if you keep digging. They're afraid you'll uncover something that should stay hidden." James fell silent, trying to process all this information. It felt like the plot of a chaotic thriller movie. He looked at Sanders with gratitude but also doubt. "Why are you helping me, Sanders? Why aren't you turning against them like the others?" Sanders gently patted James's shoulder. "I know you, James. You're a good cop. I can't just stand by and watch them ruin your life. Besides, I have my own score to settle with these people. They think they can control everything, but we're going to prove them wrong." James nodded, slowly feeling a bit calmer, even though the situation was far from safe. "So what do we do now?" Sanders looked at James seriously. "We need to get out of here fast. They won't stop just because one of them has fallen. These people have immense power, and they won't hesitate to send more hitmen if they know we're still alive. We need to gather evidence, expose everything, and make sure the truth comes out before they can stop us." James nodded firmly. Though all of this was far more complicated and dangerous than he had anticipated, one thing was clear: he wouldn't give up. What had initially seemed like a personal affair had transformed into something much larger, a battle against the corrupt forces within the police department. This time he was determined to uncover it all, even if his life was at stake. With Sanders by his side, James knew this was just the beginning. They had to keep moving, fighting against unseen enemies, and ensuring that justice was served no matter the risks involved.